James Archibald Hope's The Military Memoirs of an Infantry Officer offers a vivid account of his experiences in the British Army during the Napoleonic Wars. Hope shares insights into battles, soldier life, and the camaraderie of the infantry, providing a first-hand glimpse into the challenges and resilience of military service. These are his words. Let's begin. Before daybreak on the 6th of November, a Spanish picket, posted in a valley about a mile in front of Roncesvalles, was attacked by the enemy, and almost all killed or wounded. Although surprised, the Spaniards defended themselves with bravery and rendered the success of their opponents rather dearly purchased. The surrender of Pamplona, having placed a further effective force of 10,000 men at the disposal of the Marquis of Wellington, and changed the whole aspect of our affairs on the Pyrenees. No time was lost in making the necessary preparations for a successful attack on the enemy's fortified position, extending from Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port on the left to Saint-Jean-de-Luz on the right. Accordingly, the 2nd, 3rd and 4th Brigades of the 2nd Division marched from Roncesvalles on the 6th of November for the valley of Bastan. Our advanced posts having been withdrawn from the right of our position to the blockhouse halfway between it and Roncesvalles, the enemy, anxious no doubt to discover what we were doing, pushed forward a strong reconnoitring party on the afternoon of the 7th, and attacked the blockhouse, in which there was a captain's picket, composed almost exclusively of men of the 92nd Regiment, and commanded by a Captain Holmes of that corps. On the first alarm, the 1st Brigade got under arms and marched towards the scene of action. General Mina, who had for some time suspected the retailers of vegetables, etc., from the French side of the heights, of giving the enemy information of our movements, flew into the little marketplace and with a whip made them scamper off at a gallop, squeaking and screaming like as many pigs. On performing what the Spanish chief thought an act of justice, he mounted his charger and made the best of his way towards the blockhouse. Falling in with a few hundreds of his own troops returning from a reconnoitring excursion, he caused them to wheel to the right about and follow him. These brave fellows, preceded by their leader and followed by us, ascended the mountain at a rapid pace. On drawing near, the enemy's fire was withdrawn in a great measure from the blockhouse and directed upon the Spaniards, although at rather too great a distance to do much execution, and before the latter got very close, the French made off, hotly pursued by them. About 4 p.m. of the 8th, the 1st Brigade marched in the direction of Maya, and between 12 and 1 next morning, arrived in the village of Los Alduides. The night being extremely dark, the road narrow, and winding occasionally round the corners of frightful precipices, our movements were not unattended with danger. The mule of a brother officer, which was fastened to mine, slipped a foot on, rounding one of the sharp turns of the road, and falling over, rolled to the bottom and was killed on the spot. At daybreak on the 9th, we resumed our arms and rejoined the other brigades in rear of Maya about 4 in the afternoon. On descending the high ridge which bounds the valley of Bastan on the east, the whole space from Elizondo to the heights of Maya seemed covered with men, horses, cannon, and baggage. On such an occasion, the heart of the bachelor beats light, but of their married brethren, who, far from an amiable wife and darling children, feel those inward pangs which the former never feel, and which, but for hope, sweet hope, would in many instances render them anything but efficient members of a battalion in the field of strife. On finishing our cooking operations, the men stretched their wearied limbs on the cold ground till about 9 in the evening, when they prepared to resume their march. Being in orders for the brigade baggage guard, my name had scarcely appeared in the orderly books when my tent was filled to an overflow with officers, some depositing gold, others secrets, and a third party, the addresses of friends to whom I was to make known their melancholy death should they fall in the conflict. The scene altogether was affecting. But previous to leaving our bivouac, I prevailed upon my commanding officer to relieve me of this duty and appoint another more advanced in years, to whom I delivered up all the secrets, gold, and addresses, and proceeded with my company. Leaving our resting place a little after 9 o'clock, we crossed before midnight the summit of that memorable ridge where, far from friends or home, many of our companions had reposed ever since the 25th of July. From the heights we moved down the top of a ridge which leads thence towards the village of Urdax. The march, though short, was of the most unpleasant description, the night being dark, the ground uneven, and covered with long grass and heather, and the eyes of the whole being more than half closed in sleep. Every moment some of us were tumbling heels over head, to the imminent danger of our noses, but to the great amusement of those few who kept themselves awake. The rear of the 1st Brigade was in the act of crossing the small river Nivelle when, at 6:30 a.m. on the 10th, the artillery of the left wing announced to us that the grand struggle had commenced. A few hundred yards from the left bank of the river, we were ushered into a field where we found the other brigades of our division preparing to take part in the business of the day. Being by this time dreadfully jaded, our brigade was permitted to take a little repose before being called into active employment. The left of the enemy's position rested on a height in rear and considerably to the left of the village of Anho, and thence extended along a range of connected little hills, which there runs across the country in front of the towns of Saint-Pé and Saint-Jean-de-Luz to the sea. On their extreme left, the French had crowned the heights with 2 strong redoubts and occupied them with a considerable body of infantry. A little lower down, on the same ridge and immediately behind the village of Anho, there were 3 redoubts, each mounting several pieces of cannon of large calibre. Farther to their right, and towards the left centre of their position, the enemy had every little eminence decorated with a fieldwork of some description or other, and from the centre to the extreme right, the whole was very strong, Soult expecting that our principal attack would be made in that direction. The 3rd, 4th, 6th, and light divisions were directed to move against the centre and right and left centre of the French lines. The 1st and 5th were to amuse the enemy on the right, and the 2nd Division, General Hamilton's division of Portuguese infantry, and Murillo's Spanish corps, were directed to attack the redoubts in rear of Anho. The first operations of the armies were completely hid from our view, but by degrees the tide of war began to roll towards us from the centre, and by 10 o'clock the battle had begun to rage with considerable fury along almost every part of the enemy's line. In the centre our companions had warm work of it for some time, but having, after a desperate struggle, obtained possession of one of the enemy's principal redoubts, in which were nearly 600 men, the others deemed it more prudent to walk off after doing all the mischief they could than yielding without or braving assault. The grand object of the attack on the centre, the breaking the enemy's chain of fortified posts, being obtained, the troops engaged at that point were ordered to bring up their right and left shoulders, the 6th Division and General Hamilton's Portuguese their left, and the 3rd, 4th, and light their right, and attack the inward flanks of the enemy's right and left wings, and in conjunction with the troops on their right and left, endeavour to make them relinquish their hold of the other portions of the position. Generals Stuart, Clinton, and Hamilton severally led their divisions to the attack of the enemy behind Anho in fine style. Nothing, indeed, could possibly be more beautiful than the operations of all the 3 preceding and pending the assault of the heights and redoubts. The face of the ridge being in some places a good deal cut up, and in others thickly studded with breastworks, our companions found the ascent more difficult than some of them anticipated. But these obstacles, instead of dispiriting the assailants, rather urged them forward with a firmer and more determined pace. Having, therefore, after a long and a tough pull, fairly obtained a footing on the higher part of the ridge, they proposed to carry the forts by assault. This part of the operations was particularly interesting, as in the execution of it our troops were to show to the world whether their military prowess was confined to field operations, unobstructed by stone walls, or whether every description of military work was to them the same. The conflict was severe, but not very long, for the enemy, seeing that the British were determined to bear down all opposition, retired from their strongholds one after another, and at length, making a virtue of necessity, finally left the heights, their own guns giving them a parting salute, and retired towards Cambau on the Nive. The Allied forces which moved against the French right wing were long and sharply engaged in the neighbourhood of St. Pé. They at length succeeded, however, in forcing the enemy from the town to some heights above it, from which they annoyed our men very much with a sharp discharge of musketry, till it was pretty late in the evening. Pending these operations, a body of Spanish troops crossed the heights of Maya and attacked the advanced posts of the enemy's left wing with spirit. But pushing their success farther than prudence warranted, they were attacked in turn and driven into the valley of Bastagne, where the French succeeded in capturing some of our light cavalry baggage. How the enemy accomplished this was a complete puzzle to many. It was related at the time, and very generally credited, that if common prudence or exertion had been used, not a particle of baggage would have fallen into the hands of the French. On obtaining possession of the person and personal baggage of a British paymaster, the enemy pressed him hard for cash. Conceiving that a few guineas would satisfy his unwelcome visitants, he handed them as many as would have made the whole party more than half seas over. These they most kindly accepted and politely solicited a fresh supply. In hopes that a few more would rid him of their presence, the paymaster consented to make a further sacrifice, but instead of satisfying, it only tended to sharpen the appetite of the plunderers for the precious metal. A fresh supply was necessary, and down came 100 guineas. Surely the fellows will now cry enough, thought the paymaster. But no. Another 100 rung in his ears like the sound of a funeral bell. On tendering the second 100, "I have no more," said the paymaster. "We will prove that," replied the French. Tapping him on the shoulder, the latter said in a jocular manner, "Come now, just another 100, if you please," and repeated the same thing on receiving every additional 100, till the paymaster had dropped not quite so many guineas as the blind beggar of Bethnal Green did on the marriage of his daughter, but considerably more than he could afford to lose, or any government should under similar circumstances be called upon to pay. In this battle, generally termed the Battle of the Nivelle, our loss was 3,000 killed and wounded. That of the enemy was estimated at 4,000 killed and wounded, and 2,500 prisoners. 51 pieces of cannon also fell into our hands. Soult, having withdrawn his right wing from its position in front of Saint-Jean-de-Luz during the night of the 10th and morning of the 11th, the Allied army moved forward on the latter, the left wing towards Bayonne, the right upon Cambau on the Nive. About 10 o'clock a.m. on the 11th, the 2nd Division quitted the heights from which they had driven the enemy the preceding day, and after a trip of 3 or 4 miles halted in a field, where, under a torrent of rain, it remained the whole day without making any attempt to drive the French farther back, although they were but a little way from us all the time. The French, however, retired about sunset. We advanced to an eminence covered with heath on the left of the principal road from Anhaux to Cambau, and about 3 miles from the latter. Here we spent a most uncomfortable night, for the brushwood being so wet that it would not burn. We were deprived of our usual allowance of warm water, either made into soup or its more refreshing relative tea. Sir Rowland Hill being ordered to dislodge the enemy from Cambau, the division got under arms a little before midday on the 12th. The 2nd and 3rd Brigades moved first towards the river Nive, but on arriving within a few hundred yards of it, they brought up their left shoulders and then advanced direct upon Cambau. The 1st Brigade moved obliquely to the right till it gained the high road and then pushed along, drove back the enemy's pickets within a short distance of their works, and turning to the right, ascended an eminence which overlooked the town and the whole of the enemy's defences within range of the artillery. Here Sir Rowland reconnoitred the French, when finding them better prepared for us than was expected, he contented himself with driving back their light troops and cannonading the garrison. In the evening we retired about a mile and encamped. 2 worthy paymasters, anxious to see how the heads took leave of the shoulders of their friends, but at such a distance as to preclude every chance of a similar compliment being paid to themselves, very knowingly rode round the rear base of the ridge on which we were posted, conversing on every subject save dead and wounded paymasters. Moving along, therefore, in conscious security, and casting an eye occasionally to the left to see if any friendly sconce was twirling down the face of the hill, Mr. A had just withdrawn his optics from that quarter, and remarked to Mr. B that they had a better berth of it than their friends on the top of the hill, when a large cannonball plunged into the earth under his horse's belly. On perceiving which, away went Gilpin, away went he. We had not been long in our bivouac before the rain began to pour on us with its usual severity, and continued to pelt us unmercifully throughout the whole of the night. Our baggage being still in rear, and the wind being high, nothing could be more truly miserable than the situation of the whole brigade at daybreak on the 13th. By arranging ourselves around a few blazing fires, however, we contrived at length to have one side always pretty comfortable. Thus, while one half of our persons was nearly roasted, the other was cold as a piece of ice. On the arrival of our baggage in the afternoon, we were more comfortable, but the rain ceased not night or day from the evening of the 12th to the morning of the 16th, when the enemy retired across the Nive and destroyed 2 arches of the bridge to prevent us following them. On taking possession of Cambo a few hours afterwards, its whole population consisted of a dragoon who had been left behind, an old man and his wife completely bedridden, and a pig for the head of which I paid a few days after no less than $4. The absence of the inhabitants we did not regret, for having left all their bedding behind them, it afforded us a treat such as we had seldom experienced during the previous 6 months. Having been only 13 nights under the roof of a house out of 181 days, the campaign had continued. Liberty is so highly prized by, and is so essentially necessary to, the well-being of every individual, that we cannot be surprised that men should be tenacious of what they conceive to be their glory and happiness, and in defence of or to preserve it, sacrifice all, even life itself. An example of the strength of this feeling appears in the following occurrence. About an hour after we took possession of Cambo, a private soldier of the 66th British Regiment, who was made prisoner by the enemy on the 10th of November, escaped from his jailers and from a village immediately opposite to Cambo made direct for the bridge amid a sharp fire from a long chain of sentries. Finding the bridge destroyed, he seemed to hesitate whether he would return to his prison or commit himself to the raging waters. A great part of our brigade having by this time lined the bank of the river, provided with ropes, canteen straps, etc. to assist him, cheered on seeing him stop, which no doubt encouraged him to attempt a passage from the right to the left bank of the Nive. In an instant he plunged into the river, which being dreadfully swollen, carried him down at a fearful rate. For a few seconds appearances were in favour of his gaining the left bank in safety, but after being more than 2/3 of the way across, he sank, then rose, but sank again. A second time he appeared on the surface of the foaming deep, but in 2 or 3 seconds he again disappeared, and never rose again. The French having destroyed all the bridges on the Nive, and the river being so far above its usual level as to render a passage by the fords impracticable, the 2 armies remained cantoned on the Nive and the Adour from the 16th of November to the 8th of December, without either party attempting to resume the offensive. During all this time, we were really on a friendly footing with our opponents. The latter came down to the right bank of the Nive and conversed with us freely on every subject save politics. They were particularly anxious, however, to obtain information regarding the campaign in Germany, for they candidly admitted that the retreat of Bonaparte towards France but ill corresponded with the bulletins he had caused to be published at Paris. To enlighten them in the matter, we sent them some London newspapers, for which we received a few moniteurs in return. This we continued to do on the arrival of every succeeding packet from England until our intercourse was again interrupted by active operations. War, even when conducted according to the law of civilized nations, is attended with so many evils that every man possessed of one spark of humanity will forbear to add to them. And when measures of severity are absolutely necessary to accomplish those things which his duty may require him to perform, they will still be tempered with moderation and humanity, and instantly cease when the object he has in view is obtained. The lustre of military achievements is tarnished by nothing so much as by cruelty, which affords pleasure only to men of the most depraved habits. Acts such as that which I am about to relate, whether to gratify a mean, grovelling revenge or to suit political convenience, cannot fail to expose the perpetrators to the indignation of every person in whose breast there is to be found one particle of justice or humanity. An officer of the 92nd Regiment, being on picket at the bridge one evening, hailed the French sentry posted at the opposite side of the chasm made by the enemy when they retired from Cambau, and as he spoke the French language fluently, desired him to say to the officer on picket that he wished to have a little chit-chat with him. The latter instantly appeared, but instead of agreeing to the proposal of his opponent, he threatened him with the vengeance of all the men under his command if he did not immediately retire. In vain did Lieutenant H.I.B.'s explain the object he had in view. Bellowing and stamping like a madman, the French officer would listen to no explanation, would hear of no apology, the opportunity of lessening the number of his enemies being too favourable to allow to pass unimproved. Finding that the wrath of the hot-headed mortal would only be appeased by blood, Lieutenant H. Biez considered it more prudent to retire than brave the other alternative offered him. He accordingly walked away towards the picket house at the end of the bridge, on entering which a ball struck the door a few inches from his head, fired from a French musket by order of this disgrace to the military habit. A few days afterwards, I was detached one morning before daybreak up the left bank of the Nive to watch the motions of our not-to-be-trusted friends. Placing myself behind a very large tree immediately opposite to a village where the enemy had a considerable body of infantry, I fancied myself completely out of their view. Obtaining a glimpse of me, however, before they had dismissed their troops from the alarm post, the officer commanding the outlying picket advanced towards the river and, lifting his cap, pointed to Cambau. Paying no attention to the hint, it was instantly repeated. Having again disregarded it, he, instead of repeating the friendly signal, called down 2 files of his picket and detached as many to his right and left. These ominous preparations, particularly as my mission had ended, induced me to remove from my hiding-place and wend my way to Cambau. With my friend's bridge adventure fresh in my recollection, and not knowing but I might be treated in a similar manner, I quitted my retreat cautiously, which my opponent observing, he, to remove all suspicion from my mind, again stepped forward, and after saluting me 2 or 3 times in the most gentlemanly manner, rejoined his picket, evidently pleased with the issue of the affair. The conduct of this officer forms a delightful contrast with that of his brother sub at the bridge of Cambau, who, of all the French officers then immediately opposed to us, was perhaps the only one who could have been guilty of such a cruel and truly ungentlemanly act. Being of opinion that the death of every officer killed with the 1st Battalion, whose proper place at the time was the 2nd Battalion at home, would afford his countrymen good grounds for charging him with the crime of murder, Colonel Cameron laid it down as an invaluable rule to apply for leave to send home the officers belonging to the 2nd Battalion on their being relieved by the effective members from home. Accordingly, on the arrival of a detachment at Cambo on the 27th of November, the colonel applied and obtained permission for myself and 3 other officers to proceed to England. The latter, having arranged with the paymaster early in the forenoon, took leave of Cambo at 3 o'clock on the 8th of December. But 8 o'clock, having told before that indispensable personage and myself, had adjusted our matters, and as an order had been issued some hours before for a general attack upon the enemy's position along the whole line of the Nive, I waited upon the commanding officer and requested permission to accompany him across the river on the following morning. To this application he quickly and sternly replied, "No, sir, you have done enough," and as if this refusal was not sufficient, he sent the adjutant to me a few minutes afterwards to intimate that if I did not leave Cambo immediately, I would incur his displeasure, and if I attempted to join the regiment in the morning, he would place me under arrest. Although perfectly aware that the colonel's conduct proceeded from a friendly intention, I was nevertheless dreadfully disappointed, for on such an occasion I thought he might have indulged me. The night being dark, and my knowledge of the road being slender, I ventured for the first time in my life to disobey the orders of my commanding officer, and join a party of my friends who had assembled to dedicate a cup to him who was on the eve of bidding some of them an eternal farewell. After spending 2 or 3 happy hours, we threw ourselves upon our mattresses to catch a little repose before we should be called upon, my brethren to proceed in search of new dangers and victories, and I in search of home and friends. When I gazed on the gay and joyous countenances of the group as each individual rose to retire from the festive scene, and reflected on what an important change they severally might undergo before the close of another day, my feelings had nearly overpowered me. To describe them on that occasion, words are inadequate. Suffice it to say that they were the feelings of a man taking leave of companions whose friendship he possessed. Friendship contracted in the haunts of peace and cemented in the field of strife. Not that kind of friendship which grows out of interested motives or designs, but that which makes one man take as much interest in the fate and fortunes of another as if they were his own. Having performed the painful task of taking leave of my friends, I bade adieu to Cambo about 4 o'clock in the morning of the 9th of December and proceeded towards Espelette. I had not proceeded far, however, before I fell in with a column of Portuguese infantry hastening to the place of rendezvous. Ashamed to meet them under such circumstances, I quitted the road, but had scarcely done so when I popped into a ditch filled with water and clay. In a most uncomfortable state, I jogged along till I reached Espelette, where, meeting with an old acquaintance in the person of a commissary, I walked with him to his lodgings and there spent a couple of hours cracking the shells of a dozen of my friends' eggs and exchanging the midnight dress for one more comfortable and less offensive to the eye. On arriving at St. Pé, we procured a little refreshment in a house which still bore numerous marks of the conflict of the 10th of November, some of the musket balls being still in the wood of the partitions and windows. The worthy occupants, having a son a prisoner of war in Scotland, they begged our acceptance of a few apples to carry with us to the land of cakes. Arriving in Saint-Jean-de-Luz about sunset, we procured a billet upon a fifth-rate tavern. The entertainment was bad and prices exorbitant. Next morning we quitted Saint-Jean and proceeded towards Passages, the place of embarkation. On a height on the right bank of the Bidassoa, we remained half an hour, indulging ourselves with a distant view of the conflict between Sir John Hope's corps and the enemy near Bayonne. Crossing the river soon after, we passed through Irun and halted for the night at Renteria. On the 11th, we arrived in Passages, and next day embarked in the Britannia transport for England. Previous to going on board, We had the pleasure of seeing Colonel Cruz, at the head of the regiments of Frankfurt and Nassau, march into passages to embark. These two corps quitted the standards of the enemy during the action of the 10th near Bayonne. They were very fine-looking fellows and seemed quite delighted with the prospect of returning to their native country. Early in the morning of the 17th of December, our transport and 10 others, under convoy of a gun brig, sailed from passages. On clearing the harbour, we cast a wistful eye towards the spot whence we had come, and could not resist repeating, "Farewell, ye tented fields. Farewell, ye plains and towering heights, stained with the blood of the best and dearest of our friends. For our native land we now leave thy shores, where in the bosom of our families we hope to spend a few days in peace and domestic felicity. Gallant companions, of your heroic deeds we will read with delight, and in the fond expectation of again joining you at an early period to share in your dangers and your glory, we bid you all farewell." At this time the sky was clear, not a cloud in the horizon, and scarce a ripple on the water. So beautiful indeed and cheering were the rays of the sun that the mighty leviathans themselves skipped and gambolled for joy. 2 of these tremendous marine animals actually remained alongside of us for more than an hour. At sunset, the weather was equally promising, but soon after, the clouds. At 7 p.m., the wind became foul and blew fresh. An hour after, the lightning flashed and the thunder rolled, at first like the long roll of the muffled drum, but latterly like the salvos of a numerous artillery. At 3 a.m. on the 18th, the thunder ceased, but from that hour down to 4 in the afternoon of the 20th, when we returned into port, the wind blew a perfect hurricane. We again put to sea on the 27th of December, and after a very pleasant passage, landed at Plymouth on the 4th of January 1814. On the 6th, we proceeded towards London, where we arrived on the evening of the 8th, after a tedious ride. On arriving in London, we quitted the stagecoach in the Haymarket, placed all our trunks in a street coach under charge of Captain M. the 79th Regiment, and walked to the old Slaughter's Coffee House, St. Martin's Lane, for many years the headquarters of the officers of our regiment, when duty or curiosity led any of us to visit the metropolis. On the gallant captain's arrival, a trunk of mine was found to be absent without leave, in which were deposited upwards of 20 letters from officers and 2 orders for money, besides a number of valuable articles of wearing apparel. On perceiving my loss, I wished to advertise it as stolen, but Mr. Reed of the old Slaughters strongly opposed this, and it was finally advertised as lost. The result showed the soundness of Mr. Reed's advice, for by 10 on the morning the advertisement appeared in the Times. The portmanteau was at the bar unopened. In London, gangs of depredators are constantly prowling the streets in search of plunder, and when they obtain it in the way they got hold of my baggage, they generally keep it past them for some time unopened, when, if advertised as lost and a reward offered, as in my case, the thief then returns the property like an honest man and receives the reward of his dishonesty. At the end of a week, I took leave of the metropolis, and after spending a few days with my friends on the way, I rejoined the 2nd Battalion of the regiment in Glasgow in the end of January. That concludes the 14th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.